Dearest listeners, there exists no greater theater than the drawing rooms of Mayfair, where masks are worn not upon the face, but within the very soul. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of deception turned to devotion. As this secret begins to unfold, I encourage you to make your presence known. A like tells me you are listening intently. To subscribe ensures you never miss the next whispered secret, and a hype, should the feature be available, helps this tale become the talk of the entire season. But let us not rush, for the best stories must be savored properly. Miss Sophia Merriweather possessed the singular misfortune of being born a gentleman's daughter without benefit of a gentleman's fortune. At 25, she had long resigned herself to the narrow corridor of possibilities afforded to impoverished gentlewomen. Governess, companion, or worse yet, dependent relative shuffled between the charitable impulses of distant cousins. Her father's death 3 years prior had left nothing but debts and a collection of philosophical treatises that, whilst edifying to the soul, proved remarkably ineffective at settling accounts with tradesmen. The modest lodgings in Bloomsbury where Sophia resided with her aging aunt bore little resemblance to the grand houses of her childhood memories. Mrs. Penelope Hartwell, her father's sister, had taken her in with the resignation of Christian duty rather than familial affection. The widow's own circumstances were straitened, her husband having been merely a respectable solicitor rather than a man of property, and she viewed Sophia's presence as a burden lightened only by the younger woman's ability to assist with correspondence and household management. It was on a particularly dreary Tuesday morning in October that fate arrived in the unlikely form of Mrs. Beatrice Thornfield, a woman whose reputation for managing delicate situations among the ton was whispered about in drawing rooms throughout Mayfair. She appeared at their humble door like some elegantly dressed harbinger of possibility, her carriage bearing the unmistakable markers of prosperity despite its deliberately understated elegance. Mrs. Thornfield's proposition was as startling as it was unconventional. The Duchess of Ravenswood, recently married to the Duke after a courtship notable more for its brevity than its passion, had fallen gravely ill with a mysterious malady that had confined her to her chambers for the past month. The Duke, a man known for his pride and his devotion to proper appearances, could not bear the whispers that would inevitably arise should his Duchess's absence from society become prolonged. The autumn season was in full swing, and the Duchess's continued invisibility would fuel speculation ranging from marital discord to more scandalous possibilities. The arrangement Mrs. Thornfield proposed was audacious in its simplicity. Sophia bore a remarkable resemblance to the Duchess. Both possessed auburn hair, gray eyes, and a slender figure that would look elegant in the Duchess's extensive wardrobe. With careful coaching in the Duchess's mannerisms and intimate knowledge of her history, Sophia could attend select social functions as the Duchess, maintaining the facade just long enough for the real Duchess to recover her health and resume her duties. The compensation offered was beyond anything Sophia had dared imagine. £50 immediately, with an additional 100 upon successful completion of the charade. Such a sum would secure her independence for years, perhaps even allowing her to establish herself as a teacher of young ladies, or to purchase a small cottage in the countryside where she might live quietly but respectably. Sophia's conscience warred with her circumstances. The deception was wrong, certainly, yet what harm could come from merely attending parties and maintaining pleasant conversation? The real Duchess would recover, resume her place, and no one would be injured by the temporary substitution. Mrs. Thornfield assured her that only the most trusted servants were aware of the arrangement, and that the Duke himself, currently traveling on business matters, would not return until after the Duchess's anticipated recovery. The first lessons in becoming a Duchess took place in the grand Ravenswood mansion in Berkeley Square. Sophia marveled at the opulence surrounding her, the Chinese wallpapers, the crystal chandeliers that caught and scattered light like captured rainbows, the Turkish carpets that cushioned every footstep with luxurious silence. Mons. Thornfield guided her through the Duchess's private apartments, pointing out personal items that Sophia must become familiar with, explaining the Duchess's preferences in everything from morning chocolate to evening entertainments. The Duchess's wardrobe proved a revelation in itself. Gowns of silk and satin in every conceivable shade hung in careful arrangement, each more beautiful than the last. There were morning dresses of sprigged muslin, afternoon gowns of rich velvet, and evening costumes that seemed designed to catch candlelight and hold it prisoner in their folds. The jewel cases contained treasures that made Sophia's breath catch, sapphires the color of midnight, emeralds like captured spring leaves, and pearls that glowed with inner moonlight. Learning the Duchess's history required careful attention to detail. She had been Miss Eleanor Fairfax before her marriage, daughter of an earl with modest holdings in Derbyshire. Her education had been thorough, but not remarkable. Her accomplishments exactly what one would expect of a well-bred young lady. Competent at the pianoforte, adequate in watercolors, fluent in French, and possessed of the sort of general knowledge that allowed for pleasant conversation without appearing too learned. She had married the Duke after a courtship of precisely 4 months, their engagement announced at the height of the previous season, and their wedding celebrated with appropriate magnificence at St. George's, Hanover Square. As Sophia studied her reflection in the Duchess's looking-glass, wearing one of Eleanor's afternoon dresses and practicing her posture, she began to understand the weight of aristocratic expectation. Every gesture must be measured, every word carefully chosen, every expression appropriate to her supposed rank. The freedom she had known as Miss Merriweather, the freedom to speak her mind, to laugh spontaneously, to express genuine emotion, must be replaced by the careful performance of ducal dignity. The first test of Sophia's newfound identity came sooner than anticipated. Mrs. Thornfield had planned a gentle introduction to society, perhaps a small morning call or an intimate musical evening, but circumstances conspired to thrust her immediately into the most challenging arena of all, Lady Pemberton's autumn ball, the most significant social gathering of the early season. The evening of the ball found Sophia standing before the pier glass in the Duchess's dressing room, scarcely recognizing herself in Eleanor's magnificent gown of deep sapphire silk. The dress seemed to have been created by fairy seamstresses, its cut so perfect that it transformed her modest figure into something approaching grandeur. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. The Ravenswood parure, Mrs. Thornfield had explained, worn by Duchesses of Ravenswood for 3 generations. The weight of the jewels served as a constant reminder of the role she was playing, their cold brilliance against her skin, a tangible representation of the gulf between her true circumstances and her borrowed position. Mrs. Thornfield had coached her exhaustively in the proper manner of arrival. The Duchess would be announced, would make her curtsy to Lady Pemberton with precisely the right degree of acknowledgement, neither too familiar nor too distant, and would then circulate through the ballroom with the measured pace appropriate to her rank. She must dance, but only with partners of suitable consequence, and she must never appear to enjoy herself too obviously, as such enthusiasm would be deemed undignified. The carriage bearing the Ravenswood arms drew up before the imposing facade of Pemberton House precisely at the fashionable hour of 10 o'clock. Sophia's heart thundered against her ribs as the footman handed her down, but she managed to maintain the serene expression she had practiced for hours. The butler's announcement of Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenswood, seemed to echo through the crowded ballroom, and she felt every eye turned toward her as she made her entrance. What Sophia had not anticipated was the immediate recognition that flickered across several faces in the crowd. Not recognition of the deception, but rather the pleased surprise of seeing the Duchess in apparently restored health. Lady Pemberton herself rushed forward with expressions of delight, inquiring solicitously after her recent indisposition and expressing gratitude for her attendance despite her recent trials. Sophia managed appropriate responses, expressing gratitude for such kind concern and deflecting more specific inquiries about her illness with the sort of delicate reticence expected from a lady of breeding. As she moved through the ballroom, Sophia became aware of being observed with particular intensity by a gentleman standing near the card-room entrance. He was tall and darkly handsome, with the sort of assured bearing that spoke of unquestioned confidence in his position in the world. His evening dress was impeccable without being ostentatious, and there was something in his steady regard that made her acutely conscious of her performance. When their eyes met across the crowded room, she detected what appeared to be amusement in his dark gaze, an expression that sent an inexplicable chill of apprehension down her spine. Mrs. Thornfield had provided her with a mental catalogue of individuals she might encounter. But this particular gentleman had not been among those discussed. His presence seemed to command a degree of deference from those around him, suggesting a position of considerable consequence, yet something in his manner suggested he was viewing the evening's proceedings with the detached interest of an observer rather than a participant. The first direct challenge to her assumed identity came when Lady Margaret Westbrook, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her comprehensive knowledge of society gossip, approached with what appeared to be friendly interest. Her ladyship's conversation, however, proved to be a series of carefully constructed tests, references to mutual acquaintances and shared experiences that would have been familiar to the real Duchess, but were treacherous territory for Sophia. Only her careful study of Eleanor's history and her ability to deflect with appropriate ladylike vagueness prevented immediate discovery. It was during this delicate navigation of social rapids that the mysterious gentleman finally approached. His bow was perfectly correct, his manner impeccably polite, yet something in his introduction sent waves of alarm through Sophia's carefully maintained composure. He was Thomas Cavendish, Duke of Ravenswood, Eleanor's husband, who was supposedly traveling on business and not expected to return for several weeks. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face, then return in a rush of crimson that she prayed would not be visible in the ballroom's candlelight. The Duke's expression remained perfectly composed, his social smile never wavering, yet she detected something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes, as though a theory had been confirmed rather than a shock received. His response to her obvious distress was both gallant and terrifying in its implications. Rather than exposing her immediately, he smoothly claimed the next dance, leading her onto the floor with the sort of proprietary air that would have been entirely appropriate for a husband greeting his wife after a period of separation. As they took their places in the set, Sophia realized that her fate rested entirely in his hands. A single word from him would expose not only her deception, but potentially ruin her entirely, as the scandal of impersonating a duchess would follow her for the rest of her life. Yet as the dance progressed, the Duke's behavior remained unexceptionable. He inquired politely about her health, expressed pleasure at her apparent recovery, and conducted himself exactly as a devoted husband should. His conversation was pleasant but unremarkable, touching on safe topics that required no intimate knowledge of their supposed shared life. Only the occasional glint in his eye suggested that he was aware of the elaborate charade being played out beneath the polite surface of social convention. When the dance concluded, he escorted her back to the edge of the ballroom with every appearance of solicitude. But his final words, spoken too quietly for any other ear to catch, left her in no doubt about her situation. He expressed his hopes that she would continue to enjoy excellent health and suggested that they might find opportunity for more private conversation in the near future. The promise, or threat, implicit in his words, was unmistakable. As the Duke moved away to fulfill his social obligations, Sophia remained frozen in the devastating realization that her carefully constructed deception had been penetrated with apparent ease. Yet, equally puzzling was his decision to maintain the facade rather than expose her. The evening continued around her in a blur of music and conversation, but her mind raced with speculation about his motives and her increasingly precarious position. The days following Lady Pemberton's ball passed in a state of suspended anxiety for Sophia. Each morning she awakened expecting to find her world collapsed around her, yet no accusation came, no exposure followed. Mrs. Thornfield continued to brief her on upcoming social obligations with apparently complete ignorance of the danger they faced, and the carefully constructed routine of impersonation continued as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. The Duke's presence in London meant that future encounters were inevitable, and each social engagement now carried the additional terror of facing a man who held her fate in his hands. Sophia found herself studying her reflection obsessively, searching for flaws in her performance that might have betrayed her, wondering what had given her away so immediately to his perceptive eye. The second test came at Lady Worthington's morning music hall, an intimate gathering where Sophia would be expected to demonstrate the Duchess's supposed accomplishments at the pianoforte. She had spent hours practicing pieces she believed would be in Eleanor's repertoire, but her fingers trembled so violently as she took her place at the instrument that she feared disgrace was imminent. The Duke's presence in the drawing room, apparently absorbed in conversation with Lord Worthington about agricultural improvements, did nothing to steady her nerves. Her performance of Mozart's sonata in C major was technically competent, though her touch lacked the confidence that would have characterized a lady accustomed to performing before company. As the final notes faded and polite applause filled the drawing room, she caught the Duke's eye and found him watching her with that same expression of barely concealed amusement. His applause was perhaps a fraction more enthusiastic than strictly necessary, and she detected what might have been approval in his regard. Approval that both puzzled and unsettled her. The pattern continued through a succession of social engagements. At Mrs. Dalrymple's card party, the Duke partnered her at whist with the sort of easy familiarity that suggested long acquaintance, covering her occasional lapses in play with subtle signals and gentle guidance. At the opening night of the new production at Drury Lane, he joined her in the Ravenswood box and maintained a flow of intelligent conversation about the performance that required no specific knowledge of their supposed shared history. Most disturbing of all was Sophia's growing realization that she was beginning to look forward to these encounters. The Duke's presence, initially terrifying in its implications, had become oddly comforting. His protection of her deception seemed to extend beyond mere amusement at her situation. There was something almost gallant in his maintenance of the facade, as though he had appointed himself guardian of her reputation, despite having every right to destroy it. Their most significant encounter occurred during the fashionable hour at Hyde Park, where Sophia had joined the parade of carriages and riders that constituted one of society's most important daily rituals. She was seated in the Duchess's elegant barouche, acknowledging the bows and curtsies of acquaintances with what she hoped was appropriate ducal grace, when the Duke appeared on horseback beside her carriage. His mount was a magnificent bay stallion that seemed to reflect its master's controlled power, and he managed it with the effortless skill of a born horseman. Their conversation, as they proceeded along the carriage drive, was observed by half of fashionable London, yet it carried undercurrents that only they could detect. The Duke inquired about her impressions of the various improvements being made to the park, observations that the real Eleanor would presumably have heard him make before. Sophia found herself responding with genuine interest rather than assumed knowledge, and for several dangerous moments their exchange took on the character of authentic conversation rather than careful performance. It was during this drive that Sophia began to perceive the true complexity of her situation. The Duke was not merely tolerating her deception, he seemed to be actively enjoying it. There was something in his manner that suggested he found her performance not just adequate, but somehow preferable to whatever reality it replaced. This realization brought with it a host of uncomfortable questions about his marriage, his feelings toward his actual wife, and the nature of the game he appeared to be playing. The most revealing moment came when they encountered Lord and Lady Fitzwilliam, friends of both the Duke and Duchess who had not seen Eleanor since before her illness. Their expressions of concern and delight at her apparent recovery were exactly the sort of genuine sentiment that Sophia found most difficult to navigate, requiring responses that suggested intimate familiarity with their shared history. Yet the Duke's subtle intervention, his way of guiding the conversation into safer channels while appearing to do nothing more than participate naturally, demonstrated a level of protective care that went far beyond mere amusement. As their carriage ride concluded and the Duke took his leave with perfectly appropriate formality, Sophia found herself more confused than ever about her position. His parting words, ostensibly conventional expressions of pleasure at their meeting, carried implications that made her pulse quicken despite her better judgment. There was something in his regard that suggested he saw not the Duchess Eleanor, but Sophia herself, and furthermore, that what he saw pleased him considerably more than it should. The evening brought an invitation that could not be refused, a small dinner party at Ravenswood House itself. Mrs. Thornfield presented this as the ultimate test of Sophia's abilities, requiring her to play hostess in Eleanor's own home, surrounded by Eleanor's possessions and attended by Eleanor's servants. The irony of entertaining guests in the company of a husband who knew perfectly well that she was an impostor added layers of complexity that made Sophia's head spin. Yet as she prepared for the evening, selecting one of Eleanor's most becoming dinner gowns and practicing her manner before the Duchess's own mirror, Sophia realized that something fundamental had shifted in her perception of the situation. The terror that had initially paralyzed her had been replaced by a different sort of anxiety. Not the fear of discovery, but the more subtle dread that she was becoming dangerously invested in a role that could never truly be hers. The dinner party at Ravenswood House marked a turning point in the elaborate charade that had consumed Sophia's existence for nearly a month. The guest list was small but distinguished. Lord and Lady Pemberton, Sir William and Lady Margaret Westbrook, and Mr. and Mrs. Charles Fairfax, the latter being Eleanor's own brother and sister-in-law, whose presence represented the most dangerous test yet of Sophia's assumed identity. The grandeur of Ravenswood House's dining room, with its painted ceiling depicting classical scenes and its table set with gold plate that reflected the light of crystal chandeliers, provided a backdrop both magnificent and intimidating. Sophia took her place at the foot of the table with what she hoped appeared to be natural ease, while the Duke presided at the head with the sort of assured authority that seemed as natural to him as breathing. The early courses passed without incident, conversation flowing easily among topics safely removed from personal history. The Duke proved himself an accomplished host, guiding discussion through political developments, literary observations, and social gossip with the sort of skill that kept his guests entertained while never allowing the conversation to drift into potentially treacherous waters. Sophia found herself genuinely impressed by his dexterity, even as she remained acutely aware that his protection of her position continued despite every opportunity to expose her. The moment of greatest peril came when Mrs. Fairfax, Eleanor's sister-in-law, began reminiscing about family gatherings in Derbyshire, referencing shared memories and mutual relatives with the sort of casual intimacy that could only come from years of acquaintance. Sophia felt perspiration gather at her temples as she navigated these conversational rapids with carefully non-committal responses and strategic diversions. Yet even her near misses seemed to pass unnoticed by the company at large. It was the Duke who ultimately rescued her from an increasingly impossible situation, smoothly redirecting Mrs. Fairfax's attention to the renovation of the Derbyshire estate's gardens, a topic that allowed for general discussion without requiring specific personal knowledge. His intervention was so skillfully managed that it appeared entirely natural. Yet Sophia caught the brief glance he directed toward her and recognized both reassurance and something deeper in his expression. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and politics, Sophia found herself the center of feminine attention in a way that tested every aspect of her carefully constructed persona. Lady Pemberton inquired about her plans for the approaching winter season, while Lady Margaret sought her opinion on the latest fashions arriving from Paris. Most challenging of all, Mrs. Fairfax pressed her for details about her recent illness, expressing sisterly concern that demanded responses suggesting intimate knowledge of symptoms and treatment. Sophia managed these challenges through a combination of gracious deflection and the sort of delicate reticence appropriate to a lady of breeding discussing personal afflictions. Yet she was acutely aware that her performance, while adequate, lacked the comfortable familiarity that would have characterized genuine relationships of long standing. Every response required careful calculation, every gesture conscious consideration. Relief came when the gentlemen rejoined them, bringing with them the easier atmosphere of general conversation. The Duke's presence seemed to ease some of the pressure Sophia felt, though she could not have explained precisely why his proximity should provide such comfort. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that he, alone among the company, was fully aware of her situation and had thus far chosen to protect rather than expose her. The evening's entertainment consisted of musical performances by the ladies, a trial that Sophia had prepared for extensively. Her rendering of a plaintive ballad by Mr. Shield was received with appropriate appreciation, though she was conscious that her technique, while competent, displayed none of the confident ease that would have characterized a duchess accustomed to performing before company. Yet when she glanced toward the Duke during her performance, she found him watching her with an expression of genuine attention that had nothing to do with polite social obligation. It was after the guests had departed and Sophia was preparing to return to her modest lodgings in Bloomsbury that the evening's most significant moment occurred. The Duke, having bid farewell to their company with appropriate ceremony, requested a private word with her in his study. The room itself seemed designed to intimidate, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and its massive mahogany desk speaking of generations of ducal authority. Yet when the door closed behind them, his manner was not that of an interrogator, but rather of a conspirator sharing a particularly amusing secret. His acknowledgement of her deception was delivered with such gentle humor that it seemed almost a compliment rather than an accusation. He expressed admiration for the skill with which she had managed an impossible situation, praising her quick wit and her ability to maintain composure under extreme pressure. Most surprisingly, he conveyed no anger at having been deceived, but rather a sort of appreciative amusement at the complexity of the situation she had managed to navigate. When Sophia stammered out explanations and apologies, fully expecting disgrace and potential legal consequences, his response surprised her completely. Rather than condemnation, he offered understanding. He had, he explained, deduced her identity within moments of their first meeting, not through any failure in her performance, but through the simple fact that he had known Eleanor since childhood and would have recognized his wife regardless of illness or altered circumstances. His revelation of the true situation proved even more startling. Eleanor was not merely ill, but had been suffering from a severe nervous affliction that had rendered her increasingly unstable in recent months. Her physician had recommended complete retirement from society as the only hope for eventual recovery, but the Duke's pride and Eleanor's own desperate desire to maintain appearances had led to increasingly desperate measures to conceal her condition. Mrs. Thornfield's proposition had seemed like divine intervention, a way to preserve the Duchess's reputation while allowing her the privacy necessary for treatment. What the Duke did not say, but what Sophia began to understand through his careful explanations, was that his marriage to Eleanor had been more a matter of dynastic obligation than personal inclination. Their union, arranged by families and approved by society, had provided neither party with the companionship or affection that might have made their situation bearable. Eleanor's mental fragility had only exacerbated the distance between them, creating a household that functioned perfectly in public while remaining essentially empty of warmth or genuine connection. As these revelations settled between them in the study's lamplight, Sophia began to comprehend the true complexity of her position. She was not merely impersonating a duchess. She had become a temporary replacement for a wife whose absence had apparently improved rather than diminished her husband's contentment. The realization brought with it a host of uncomfortable implications about her own growing attachment to a role that could never be permanently hers. The revelation that the Duke had known her true identity from their first meeting transformed Sophia's understanding of everything that had transpired between them, yet it created new uncertainties that proved even more troubling than her original fears of discovery. If he had been protecting her deception knowingly, what did that suggest about his motivations? And more disturbing still, what did it mean that she had begun to anticipate their encounters with something dangerously resembling eagerness? The weeks that followed their private conversation in his study established a routine that felt both natural and profoundly artificial. By day, Sophia continued to fulfill the Duchess's social obligations with increasing confidence, her performance refined by practice and strengthened by the Duke's subtle support. By evening, when public duties were completed, she would often find herself invited to remain at Ravenswood House for private dinners that had nothing to do with maintaining appearances and everything to do with what appeared to be genuine enjoyment of her company. These intimate evenings revealed aspects of the Duke's character that his public persona concealed. Away from the need to maintain ducal dignity, he proved to possess both a sharp wit and a genuine interest in ideas that went far beyond the typical concerns of his class. Their conversations ranged from literature to politics to philosophy, discussions that challenged Sophia's mind in ways she had never expected to experience. More dangerously, they revealed that beneath her assumed role her own personality was emerging more clearly than ever before. The Duke seemed to take particular pleasure in these glimpses of her authentic self. When she forgot to maintain Eleanor's careful restraint and responded to his observations with genuine enthusiasm, his expression would warm in a way that made her pulse quicken despite every rational warning her mind provided. When she offered opinions that went beyond what would have been expected from a conventional Duchess, his attention sharpened with apparent appreciation rather than disapproval. It was during one such evening, as they sat in the library discussing Mr. Coleridge's latest verses, that the first crack appeared in the comfortable arrangement they had established. The Duke's comment about the pleasure of conversing with someone who possessed both intelligence and authenticity was delivered with such pointed meaning that Sophia could not mistake his implication. He was not merely appreciating her performance as Eleanor. He was responding to her as Sophia, and furthermore, he was responding in ways that suggested his interest went far beyond amusement at an elaborate deception. The realization terrified her more than discovery ever had. To be exposed as an impostor would mean disgrace and ruin, certainly. But to find herself genuinely cared for by a man whose wife she was impersonating represented a different sort of impossibility. Even if Eleanor never recovered sufficiently to resume her place, even if the current arrangement could continue indefinitely, what future could exist for emotions that had taken root in deception and grown in the soil of elaborate pretense? Her distress must have been visible, for the Duke's manner immediately shifted to one of concern. His gentle inquiries about her well-being, his assurances that she need have no fears for her position or her safety, only emphasized the growing complexity of her situation. His kindness was genuine, his protection complete, yet both were offered to a woman living under an assumed name in circumstances that made any authentic relationship impossible. The crisis came, as crises often do, from an entirely unexpected quarter. Mrs. Thornfield arrived at Ravenswood House one morning with news that shattered the careful equilibrium they had maintained. Eleanor's physician had recommended her immediate removal to a private facility in Scotland, where specialized treatment might offer some hope of eventual recovery. The journey would be undertaken in complete secrecy, officially explained as an extended visit to relatives, yet the physician's private assessment, confided to Mrs. Thornfield, was far more grave than they had dared imagine. Eleanor's condition had deteriorated to such a degree that recovery was no longer considered possible. The severe nervous affliction that had begun as episodes of melancholy and confusion had progressed to a complete detachment from reality. During her few remaining lucid moments, she had been plagued by a desperate terror that her condition would become known to society, bringing scandal not only upon herself, but upon the Duke and the ancient name of Ravenswood. The proposed solution was as elegant as it was impossible. Sophia would continue indefinitely as the Duchess, allowing Eleanor to pursue treatment without social consequence while preserving the Duke's reputation and position. The financial compensation offered would ensure Sophia's security for life, while Eleanor's eventual recovery, if it occurred, could be managed as a gradual return to health rather than an admission of serious mental illness. Sophia's immediate response was one of horrified refusal. To temporarily impersonate a duchess for a few weeks was one matter. To assume another woman's identity permanently was something else entirely. Yet even as she voiced these objections, she was acutely aware of other considerations that made her position even more untenable. Her feelings toward the Duke had progressed far beyond the bounds of proper employment, and the prospect of remaining in daily contact with him while living such an elaborate lie seemed like a recipe for both emotional disaster and inevitable exposure. The Duke's reaction to Mrs. Thornfield's proposal proved even more complex than Sophia had anticipated. Rather than relief at having found a solution to his domestic difficulties, he seemed deeply troubled by the ethical implications of the arrangement. His concern for Eleanor's well-being was evident, yet so was his awareness that prolonging the current deception would place impossible burdens on Sophia, while potentially compromising her future in ways that went far beyond financial consideration. Their discussion of the proposal, conducted in the privacy of his study while Mrs. Thornfield waited in the morning room for their decision, marked the most honest conversation they had yet shared. The Duke's admission that he had found more genuine companionship in recent weeks than in all the months of his marriage was delivered with such careful restraint that its significance was unmistakable. Sophia's acknowledgement that she had come to value their association beyond all proper bounds was equally measured, yet equally clear in its implications. The impossibility of their situation seemed to hang between them like a physical presence. Two people who had discovered an unexpected affinity were separated by circumstances that made any authentic relationship unthinkable. Even if Eleanor never recovered, even if the deception could be maintained indefinitely, what sort of foundation could such elaborate pretense provide for genuine affection? It was in the midst of this painful recognition that Mrs. Thornfield returned with news that changed everything once again. A message had arrived from Scotland bearing the physician's seal. Eleanor's condition had deteriorated rapidly during the journey north, and she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Yet the message contained an additional element that would transform their understanding of the entire situation. A letter Eleanor had dictated to Mrs. Thornfield's trusted companion during one of her final lucid moments. A letter that revealed the true depth of her awareness and generosity. Eleanor's letter, written in the shaking hand of someone struggling against both physical weakness and mental fragility, proved to be a document of such unexpected generosity and insight that it left both Sophia and the Duke stunned into silence. Rather than the desperate pleadings they had expected, Eleanor's words revealed a woman who had found peace in acknowledging truths she had previously been unable to face. The letter began with Eleanor's admission that she had been aware, through Mrs. Thornfield's careful reports during her lucid intervals, of the impersonation being carried out in her name. Far from feeling betrayed or resentful, she expressed profound gratitude to Sophia for preserving her reputation and protecting her family from scandal. More surprisingly, she revealed that the detailed accounts she had received of Sophia's performance and her interactions with Thomas had brought her clarity about truths she had previously been unable to face. Eleanor's most startling revelation concerned her marriage itself. With the brutal honesty that sometimes accompanies mental crisis, she acknowledged that their union had been a mistake from its inception, a joining of two people who were fundamentally unsuited to each other despite their family's approval and society's expectations. Her condition, she wrote, had been exacerbated by the strain of trying to fulfill a role for which she was temperamentally unprepared, while witnessing her husband's growing unhappiness in a marriage that satisfied neither party's deeper needs. What followed was even more extraordinary. Through Mrs. Thornfield's detailed observations and reports, Eleanor had learned of the growing understanding between Sophia and the Duke. She had been told of their conversations, their ease of companionship, and the sort of genuine affinity that her own marriage had never possessed. Rather than feeling jealous or betrayed, she had experienced something approaching relief at knowing her husband had found the kind of intellectual and emotional partnership that their relationship had never provided. The letter's conclusion contained a request that stunned both recipients with its generosity and its recognition of realities that conventional morality would have required her to ignore. Eleanor expressed her hopes that Thomas, once a proper period of mourning had been observed, would marry Sophia, whom she described as having been a better Duchess in weeks than she had managed to be in months. Her death, she wrote, freed them to find the happiness that her illness had made impossible during her lifetime. Eleanor's reasoning was both practical and deeply compassionate. Sophia had already proved her ability to fulfill the role of Duchess with both dignity and skill. The Duke had found in her the sort of partnership that made both personal happiness and public effectiveness possible. Their feelings for each other, while they had developed under unusual circumstances, were clearly genuine and deeply rooted. Most importantly, Eleanor's death, while tragic, freed them from the impossible situation that her illness had created. The Duke's response to Eleanor's final letter revealed depths of character that Sophia had only begun to glimpse during their weeks of association. Rather than relief at being freed from the complications of his marriage, he seemed genuinely grieved by Eleanor's death and moved by her final generosity. His immediate concern was for Eleanor's family and for ensuring that her final wishes regarding her burial and remembrance were carried out with all appropriate dignity. Sophia's own reaction was no less complex. Eleanor's death removed all obstacles to acknowledging her feelings for the Duke. yet it also highlighted the tragic circumstances under which those feelings had been allowed to develop. Could emotions that had grown during such sorrowful times provide a foundation for authentic happiness? And perhaps more troubling still, could she ever be certain that the Duke's regard was for her true self, rather than for the woman she had learned to portray? Their conversation following Eleanor's letter marked the first time either had spoken directly about the feelings that had developed between them. The Duke's admission that he had come to care for her went far beyond polite appreciation for her assistance with a difficult situation. He had, he revealed, found himself anticipating their encounters with an eagerness that had nothing to do with maintaining appearances and everything to do with genuine affection for her character, her intelligence, and her remarkable strength in managing an impossible situation. Sophia's acknowledgement of her own feelings was more hesitant, colored by her awareness of the vast difference in their social positions and her uncertainty about whether her emotions were genuine or simply the product of proximity and unusual circumstances. Yet even her doubts could not entirely suppress the recognition that the Duke had shown her a version of herself she had never known existed, confident, capable, worthy of respect and attention from a man whose good opinion she had come to value above all others. The practical matters following Eleanor's death proved less complicated than might have been expected, though they required careful management to avoid speculation. The official explanation of her demise, that she had succumbed to the nervous affliction that had required her retirement from society, satisfied social curiosity without generating scandal. Thomas's period of mourning was observed with appropriate solemnity, though those close to him could not help but notice that his grief seemed tempered by something that might have been described as peaceful resolution. More fundamentally, both Sophia and the Duke recognized that any future relationship between them must be built on authentic foundations rather than the elaborate performance that had brought them together. If they were to have any hope of genuine happiness, Sophia must cease being the false Duchess Eleanor and discover whether the Duke could care for Miss Sophia Merryweather with the same regard he had shown for her assumed persona. The year of mourning that propriety demanded would provide the necessary time for such discovery. The year of mourning that followed Eleanor's death proved both a trial and a blessing for both Sophia and Thomas. Propriety demanded that they observe appropriate distance during this period, yet it also provided exactly the time they needed to discover whether their feelings could survive the transition from extraordinary circumstances to ordinary courtship. Sophia returned to her modest lodgings in Bloomsbury, resuming her identity as Miss Merryweather, while Thomas dealt with the responsibilities of a widowed duke. During those months, Sophia rediscovered herself in ways both liberating and occasionally unsettling. The freedom to be merely Miss Merryweather was welcome. Yet the silence of the cramped apartments in Bloomsbury sometimes echoed with memories of the brilliance of Mayfair's drawing rooms. The transition tested her resolve, forcing her to examine whether her feelings for Thomas were genuine affection for the man or merely attachment to the world he inhabited. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself managing not only his grief for Eleanor, but also his growing certainty about his feelings for Sophia. His calls at Mrs. Hartwell's modest establishment shocked that good lady into speechlessness initially, though his respectful manner and obvious serious intentions gradually won even her approval. The Duke's treatment of Sophia, clearly based on genuine regard rather than mere gallantry or obligation to Eleanor's memory, convinced even the most skeptical observers of the authenticity of his sentiments. Their courtship during this period followed patterns that were both conventional and entirely unique. Their conversations during carefully chaperoned visits revealed compatibilities that went far beyond the superficial harmony they had maintained in London society. Thomas's interests in agricultural improvement and his progressive ideas about the responsibilities of landowners found unexpected resonance with Sophia's own concerns about social justice and her observations of the hardships faced by the working classes. Her education, while less formal than his, had included wide reading and serious thought about subjects that most women of her background were never encouraged to consider. More significantly, they began to understand how their unusual introduction had actually provided advantages that conventional relationships lacked. Rather than the artificial atmosphere of drawing room flirtations and carefully supervised encounters, they had been able to observe each other in situations that revealed character under pressure. Sophia had witnessed Thomas's integrity in his protection of her deception, his kindness in his treatment of someone essentially at his mercy, and his wisdom in navigating complex social and ethical dilemmas. Thomas had observed Sophia's intelligence in her masterful performance, her strength under impossible pressure, and her genuine concern for Eleanor's well-being despite being placed in circumstances that might have justified resentment. Thomas found himself appreciating the transition from Duchess to ordinary gentlewoman that allowed him to know Sophia's authentic character. Her freedom to express opinions without considering their appropriateness to an assumed rank revealed depths of intelligence and compassion that her performance as Eleanor had only hinted at. His consistency in treating her with the same respect and attention he had shown when she was ostensibly the Duchess proved crucial in helping her trust the authenticity of his feelings. The most significant test of their developing relationship came during the winter months, when social obligations were fewer and they were able to spend time in more natural settings. Thomas's invitation for Sophia to visit his country estate in Derbyshire, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Hartwell and his own elderly aunt, provided opportunity to observe each other away from London's artificial constraints. The estate's beauty and Thomas's obvious love for the land and its people revealed aspects of his character that his ducal duties had concealed, while Sophia's genuine interest in the lives of the tenants and her practical suggestions for improvements impressed Thomas with her understanding of responsibilities that came with privilege. Their engagement, announced at the conclusion of the proper mourning period, generated exactly the amount of speculation they had expected. Thomas's brief first marriage and its tragic conclusion had been handled with such discretion that society's curiosity focused more on Sophia herself than on the circumstances of their meeting. Her dignified bearing during the courtship period, combined with Thomas's obvious devotion and the gradual revelation of her intelligence and character, had won over even the most skeptical observers. The wedding itself, celebrated at St. George's, Hanover Square with appropriate but not ostentatious ceremony, marked the culmination of a romance that had begun in deception but had grown into something far more valuable than either party had initially imagined possible. On the morning of the ceremony, Sophia wore Eleanor's pearl brooch, a tangible symbol of blessing from beyond the grave that served as both remembrance and benediction. As Sophia stood beside Thomas, speaking vows that committed them to a shared future based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and hard-won understanding, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The skills she had learned in impersonating a duchess, confidence, grace under pressure, the ability to navigate complex social situations, would serve her well in her authentic role. More importantly, the relationship that had developed under such unusual circumstances had revealed depths of character in both herself and Thomas that conventional courtship might never have uncovered. Their wedding guests, observing the obvious affection between bride and groom, could only speculate about the full story behind their union. Yet those who knew them best recognized that whatever circumstances had brought them together, the result was a partnership based on mutual respect, shared interests, and the sort of genuine compatibility that made both personal happiness and public effectiveness possible. As the new Duchess of Ravenswood, Sophia found herself in the curious position of resuming a role she had once played as fiction but could now inhabit as truth. The skills Eleanor had inadvertently taught her through necessity proved invaluable in fulfilling the genuine responsibilities of her position, while the understanding she and Thomas had developed during their unconventional courtship provided a foundation for both private contentment and public service. The irony was not lost on either of them that Sophia had become a better duchess through learning to play the role than she might have been had she been born to it. Her understanding of the struggles faced by those less fortunate, gained through her own experience of reduced circumstances, informed her charitable work and her approach to the responsibilities that came with her position. Thomas's appreciation for her authentic character, rather than merely her ability to fulfill social expectations, created a partnership that benefited not only themselves, but all those whose lives they touched through their various endeavors. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the most elaborate deceptions and the strictest conventions of proper society. What began as an exercise in borrowed identity had revealed authentic selves worthy of genuine devotion, proving once again that the heart's truest wisdom often lies in recognizing worth wherever it may be found, regardless of the circumstances under which such recognition first occurs.